Yo, what's going on, everybody? Hey, we're back with a paradigm shift. Get back on track. And today we're going to be focusing on Jonah chapter 2. I pray that you took time to read over the book of Jonah. It's a very good book, and I pray that this series of a paradigm shift really speaks to you. I pray that it helps you to see the problem and learn how to fix the problem through the Word of God, just as Jonah is teaching us. And that brings me to the lesson here. And that's what we talked about last week. Last week we talked about what Jonah was teaching us, right? We talked about the first step in fixing the problem is to first admit what? Admit that I have a problem, right? Admit that there is a problem in my life and I need to fix it. And also stop pointing fingers at everybody else but yourself, right? As Jonah did in chapter 1, verse 12. I'll read it again. He said, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. And I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." So that's the thing. We have to learn how to accept our fault. That's how we start to fix the problem in our lives. Nobody else caused calamity in your life. Nobody else caused problems in your life. Nobody else caused things that are happening in your life to happen but you. And once we recognize and realize that we are the ones who have to point the fingers at ourselves and say, man, that was me, that was my fault, that's when we can move on, and that's when we'll be able to discern and understand the calling that God has on our lives. So let's hop into chapter 2. So here we are in chapter 2. Chapter 1 ends where Jonah is cast into the sea by the sailors. They've gotten rid of their problem, right? It's something that we're trying to work on. What is it that we need to get rid of so that we can get that peace that we've been missing all our lives? What is it that we can get rid of so that we can obtain that happiness and that true joy, authentic peace that we've longed for? And that's what Jonah is teaching us. That's what Jonah is teaching us throughout the entire book of Jonah. So it ends off, he's thrown overboard and the sea grows calm. Verse 17 ends like this. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So here Jonah is, he's staring his problems dead smack in the face. He's at the bottom of this sea, and everything that he had just run from, he's now staring face to face with it. And a lot of times that's how God do us. No matter how much or how far we go, you cannot get away from God. The Bible says this in the book of Psalms, if I make my bed in the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths of hell, you are there. So no matter how far we try to run or how many times we run away from the calling that God has placed on our lives, we will never get away from God. God will always catch up with you. And that's what happened. Many times God will make us face that problem head on. But as we mentioned in the first lesson, we have to first recognize that there is a problem. We have to first admit that was my fault, and I've caused this calamity. I've caused this mess. I've caused this drama. Nobody caused that. Nobody else causes problems in your life. It's what you allow in your life. So here Jonah is. He's in the sea, and God causes a whale to swallow him. He's swallowed by a large fish, and he's in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And if we really were to get into into the theology of this chapter, this typifies a type of Christ. The same way Jonah is in a grave, if you will. Jonah is in a pit, if you will, just as Jesus was in the grave. But we're not going to get into that right now because that's not the lesson. Here's the lesson. We have not been inside of the belly of a whale. None of us has ever been inside of the belly of a whale. But what this picture is representing is Jonah being in the belly of a whale is us being in the belly of darkness. It's pitch black dark where Jonah is. Some of us have been in darkness. Some of us have been in calamity. Some of us have been in trials and tribulation. We have been in depression. We've been in the belly of worry and fear and anxiety and all of this stuff. And instead of allowing all of that Jonah was faced with to consume him, he began to pray. That's why I say a lot of times that the most important thing that you can do in life when troubles hit, when trials hit, when all this stuff start happening, prayer. That's how we not allow these things to consume us so much to the point to where we just give up. That's usually what happens. What usually happens is we allow all of the stuff that's going on in our lives to consume us so to where we don't even care anymore. We just give up on it. But what Jonah is teaching us here in chapter 2 is learn how to pray. Even in the midst of your calamity, even in the midst of your storm, even in the midst of your trials, your tribulation, your depression, your worry, your fear, your anxiety, your hurt, we have to learn how to pray even in the midst of all of that. Here we are in the text, and I'll read through this. Verse 1 says this. I'm reading from the NIV version. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said these words. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Man, I want to get into this. I want to get into this theologically, man, because this is really typifying what Jesus did when he was in the grave. But I'll keep going. Verse 3, you hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. Number 6, to the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath bared me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. That's verses 1 through 6. Now I want to home in on that 6th verse. At the very end, the B part, Jonah says this, but you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Many times in our lives, many times in our lives, it seems as though we are in a pit. And that's what Jonah compares the belly of the whale. He compares it to being in a pit. All of us have been in a pit. My brother-in-law said this one time, pit, purpose in trials. Every situation we find ourselves in, whether it's a bad one, whether it's a good one, whether it's ugly, whether it's pretty, whether it's not so comfortable, or whether it's comfortable, there's always a purpose and the reason behind the situation that we're in. Because sometimes, here's what happens. Check this out. God will sometimes allow things to happen. That's what we have to get used to. Learning how to accept what God allows in our lives. A lot of times we may not be happy with it. We may not agree with the current situation that we're in. But here's the reason why God allows those things to happen. Because there's always a purpose in your trial. There's always a purpose when you're in your pit, when you're low, when you're in that belly of depression, in that belly of darkness, in that belly of fear, whatever you're going through, there's always something that's going to come up out of it, just as it did here with Jonah. As we move on, we go to verse number 7. Verse number 7 says this: when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah unto dry land. So here we have once again, Jonah is back to what we originally were talking about. The very first step in repairing the problem in your life, right? The calamity in your life, the trouble and situations in your life is admitting that you have a problem, admitting that is your fault. Jonah here is once again teaching us how to first admit that it's us. So what Jonah does, he tells God, I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. I will make good. He's pointing the finger at himself. He's showing us how to stop saying you did this and they did that and this the reason why I'm like this because they did this. He's pointing the finger at himself saying, I will do this because I'm the reason for this mess. So we have Jonah. Verse number 10 says, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Jonah here is delivered from his problems, from his pain, from all the things that he caused because of disobedience. Jonah is delivered simply because of one act of faith, if you will. And that's admitting to first God that, hey, it was my fault, God, I apologize. Through prayer. And second to himself, that it wasn't the sailor's fault. It wasn't mama and daddy's fault. Hello, somebody. It wasn't brother or sister fault. It wasn't my job fault. It wasn't uncle and auntie fault. It wasn't the group home's fault. It was my fault because I allowed this stuff to happen. I allowed it to happen. So that's the reason why I'm in this predicament. But now that I have accepted that it's my fault and I went to God, I've asked God to forgive me for that sin. Now God is getting ready to deliver you. He's getting ready to, as Jonah said right here in verse number 9, I will say salvation comes from the Lord. So what we have to do in order to get back on track first is to admit to our own faults, our disobedience, our wrongdoings, just as Jonah did. And then we'll be delivered. Then we'll be set free from all of the pain and worry that we've caused ourselves. Brothers and my sisters, that's going to conclude episode 5 of Paradigm Shift. Get back on track. Jonah chapter 2. On next week, we'll pick up with Jonah chapter number 3. Chapter number 3, Jonah actually goes into Nineveh. Jonah accepts the calling and he actually goes into Nineveh where he preaches to this city. And he shows courage, he shows strength behind the calling that God had placed on his life. And that's what he's encouraging us to do as well. Show courage, show strength, because the Lord said he'll be with you wherever you go. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear, for I am with you, as he told Joshua, wherever you go. So, that's all for me this week. I'll see you guys next week. As we always say, I love you all. There's nothing you can do about it. I pray for you. You pray for me. Let's get back on track.